Alright, Adrian playing a Tepes Jar alucard here, and this is another Castlevania lore video. So, today this is not just a lore video, it's also a review. So, today we're going to be talking about a review for Castlevania Curse of Darkness. Now, this game is having its 20th anniversary at the time of this premiere, which is November 1st. It's All Saints Day if you are Catholic, and November 1st is also Day of the Dead, or Del Dia de los Muertos if you're Mexican. So to begin, I'm just going to give a little overview here. In the history of long-running video game franchises, there is often that occasional game that wanders from the formula of most games of the series. Maybe that game proves to be a hit, maybe it doesn't. Now, the game I'm referring to in this case is Castlevania Curse of Darkness. Castlevania is a game series began back in 1986 with the release of Castlevania Alucard Dracula, first released for the Famicom, then for the NES, or Nintendo Entertainment System. Also, for the other Nintendo personal computer known as MSX2, there was Vampire Killer released later in 1986. The Vampire Killer, while it was the same character and general concept of Castlevania, where you play as Simon Belmont, featured a different gameplay progression with finding keys to unlock new doors and access new areas of the castle, as opposed to the more linear action platform which the original Castlevania had. The mechanic of keys unlocking doors to new areas would be brought back to later Castlevania games known as the Metroidvanias. There would be a number of Castlevania games in the series where you play as different members of a family lineage known as the Belmont family, or Belmont clan. While the first protagonist featured in the Castlevania games was Simon Belmont, you could later play as other members of the same family both the time of Simon Belmont before the time in Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse, or in two of the original Nintendo Game Boy Castlevania games, you could play as Christopher. Later you would play as members of the bloodline such as Richter, or even non-Belmont such as the son of Dracula, Noah, the Morrises, or the Alucards. In the first Castlevania game, we had the option of playing a non-Belmont character was Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse, in which you can unlock 3 possible companion characters as Trevor Belmont, or you can play insane Dark Souls difficulty as Ultimate Trevor Belmont. Yes, think of the last option to Trevor solo as a Dark Souls playthrough. This will come up later in the story behind the making of the game Curse of Darkness, which I'm mentioning right now. But as we go through the 5th generation of video game consoles, there was a rush to bring numerous game franchises into the 3rd dimension. Castlevania was no exception. The first Castlevania with 3D gameplay was that of Castlevania for the Nintendo 64 in 1999, or as it is referred to in slang, Castlevania 64, to distinguish it from the 1986 game. I'll have a later video talking about Castlevania 64. After Castlevania 64 in 1999, there was an Ultimate Edition released next year known as Legacy of Darkness, with additional campaigns for Cornell the Werewolf, along with that of Henry Oldry. After that was the release of Castlevania Lament of Innocence and Castlevania Curse of Darkness, which we'll be talking about today in anticipation of this game's 20th anniversary on November 1st, 2025. Now, I mentioned the canceled 3D Castlevania name known as Castlevania Resurrection, meant to be released on the Sega Dreamcast and meant to feature Victor Belmont, a character living in the 19th century, only to time travel back in the past to meet a time-traveling Sony Belmont who time traveled into her future in the 16th century. The game is cancelled, but there's demo footage shown in this video, which you can also view on VTube via links in the description. In short, Castlevania never had a good franchise in terms of trying to transition into 3D gameplay. There was the 3D game called Castlevania Lords of Shadow, Lords of Shadow 2, but that reboot was an alternate timeline, alternate continuity, and the first one was the highest selling game called Castlevania, 1.77 million copies sold. However, that game, as I said, it was a reimagining and it was canon, so I'll have an older video where I talked about the Lords of Shadow continuity. You can go check that one out. Going back to Castlevania Curse of Darkness, the game was more or less a project produced by Koji Igarashi, who has stated that Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse had been his favorite game in the series in interviews. He made a game which serves as a direct sequel with Curse of Darkness. Also on board in the making of this direct sequel after the earlier origin story and prequel from Lament of Innocence, released in 2003, you have a summoning system similar to the summon familiar cards in Symphony of the Night. However, the summoning system in Curse of Darkness is more complex than its predecessor in more ways than one. Summon creatures, as they are called, innocent devils in the game, have a complex system over which they evolve into more advanced forms and gain use special abilities. Yes, you can use Pokemon on this one. There's multiple ways to evolve your various innocent devils in Curse of Darkness, depending on the type of weapon equipped when you destroy your enemies while your innocent devil is summoned. Without summoning, well, you're essentially playing a game similar to Dark Souls. You have to fight, dodge, grab various items you can to throw at these bosses, similar to Dark Souls. So, in this game, not only do you have summoning, but you also have a crafting system. You can craft armor, weapons, and other items from materials you collect around the game, or even pickpocket off your enemies using the steal ability. So after talking about all these interesting features, I'm going to talk about where I got disappointed with this game. The game is almost entirely combat. They hardly have any death traps in the game. You can recreate the effects of death traps with some of your abilities, like making swords rain from the sky or making spikes pop up from the floor with your weapons, but these death traps you think of, like pendulum blades, spikes, that you think of in all your games called Castlevania from the beginning, you're not really here. You can't really step on spikes and be turned to shish kebab in this game, unfortunately. You can't really have lava, you can't really get crushed in cogs, and so on. So, it gave up a lot of what you considered Castlevania, even in Metroidvanias, even Symphony of the Night that came before this. Is it enjoyable? Well, to a lot of people it is. The thing that I'm going to say that my disappointment lies in this game is not really what you have in Castlevania. And what you used to have was traps. You used to have more complex puzzles, and this game gets taken up almost entirely in fighting. One monster fighting another, and so on. So it's enjoyable for the combat to me, and the story and what it added was interesting, but otherwise it's an okay game, sadly. I do not hate this game, mind you. I doubt I'd be putting all these hours into finding all the secrets in this game if I didn't like it, okay? But otherwise, I enjoy it as a type of fighting game similar to Dark Souls games or God of War, but when it comes to God of War, this game and God of War were the same year released, and they had their development cycles coming beforehand. So I can't really say that one copied off the other. I could say that they were from developers that have a similar idea when making it. Now, getting to this game, there's a major plot spoiler. So, spoiler alert. All right, there'll be chapter markers here. And then we'll move on to give you the spoilers. You've been warned if you haven't played this game. And no, the Netflix series does not spoil this, even though it is based or somewhat inspired off Curse of Darkness. So, after this spoiler, let's get started. So, in Curse of Darkness, you have Hector and Isaac. Hector and Isaac were taught by Dracula how to summon demons from hell to fight for Dracula's army. Of course, one of the best aspects of this game is that it has perhaps the greatest plot twist in a Castlevania game ever. So, unlike the Netflix animated series, you have this devil forging, but it turns out from the devil forging, the whole point of them being taught to summon hell demons by Dracula was that they could become Dracula. Like, their bodies become vessels for Dracula's soul, so if he dies, they become him. But rather, it gets a little more difficult than that, because the Forge Master has to die for Dracula to enter their body, and they become Dracula. So, this is one of the worst reveals ever. I mean, there is this plot reveal in Castlevania that you're playing as Dracula. It happens in Lord of the Shadow, it happens in Aria of Sorrow, well, a little more complicated than that, but in this one, unwillingly, you would become Dracula at this game if you died. If Hector dies, because you're playing as Hector, he would become Dracula, and now Dracula can go around causing havoc again. And what's worse in this game is that they've taken away Trevor Belmont as a threat during the events of this game. So now Dracula's back because Hector failed, and Dracula can go and essentially rule the world. possibly. His son's out of commission. His son's in the coffin. The wife and child of Trevor could be hunted down, and if he still has Isaac, it's even worse. So that's the craziest and most scary plot twist in Castlevania. The fact that Hector could become Dracula if he died. And now Dracula's back and caused all the problems. So it's horrific, and it's very different from what you got in the Netflix series as a type of fantasy political drama, and here you have just straight up horror, the legacy of the Dracula movies like the Hammer films starring Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. And it's even worse than what you have in maybe Castlevania 64, where you find out the boy named Mollis is literally Dracula using the body of a child to trick you. So at the end, I'm going to say, what was Curse of Darkness? It was a type of spiritual predecessor to Dark Souls, and a lot of mechanics at the very least. Similar to God of War, although these games came out the same year. And so it's more or less different minds in gaming thought alike when developing. Boss battles in this game can get tough towards the end. Especially if you don't know how to do a perfect guard or block, time the block pushing button with the attack, and your block will fail if you don't block perfectly. And there's some things that are just unblockable. So all these bosses, and even the hidden Legion bosses, are so difficult in this game. So I enjoy it as a type of fighting game. It's not exactly a Castlevania game though. And even unlike the Metroidvania games, it's, as I should say, you don't really have the mechanical death traps. However, as a game, I would rate it a 7 out of 10. Yes, you heard me, 7 out of 10. And I just want to say, let's celebrate Curse of Darkness being released, because it was a nice game to have. Not a great Castlevania game, but it's an amazing game to have back in 2005. And let's celebrate this 20th anniversary together, shall we? And hopefully, if Konami continues the pattern of re-releasing and making Metal Gear, Silent Hill, and Castlevania, there could be a hypothetical Castlevania 3D collection. And I've had this video previously where my guest Alberto and I talked about how a 3D collection could be for Castlevania. And check it out. Put some input in the comments as well on how you think a Castlevania 3D game collection, including Curse of Darkness, Lament of Innocence, 64, Legacy of Darkness, could work. Meantime, I was glad you stopped by to join me in celebrating the 20th anniversary of Castlevania Curse of Darkness. In the meantime, as I always say in conclusion, until we meet again, farewell.